Merci de vous joindre. Merci de vous joindre à nous. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to our session entitled Education as a Prevention Tool, Fighting Hate Speech and Promoting Digital Citizenship. At the outset, I wish to thank all of you, and first and foremost, of course, our speakers for your participation in this important conference. And congratulations, of course, to the UNESCO Chair in Democracy, Global Citizenship and Transformative Education for organizing such an outstanding and impressive event. Hate speech is rising against the backdrop of growing polarization and the rise of regressive ideological tendencies that profoundly damage the quality of public political discourse, threaten democratic values, and undermine social cohesion. This creates a vicious circle. The current global situation, uncertain, unstable, anxiogenic, is also fueled by growing trends of identity-based hate speech that are entrenched in deeply rooted forms of marginalization and discrimination. This is even more alarming in a context in which social media act as a catalyst for further polarization and a space for the manifestation of the most dangerous ideologies. Let us be clear in regard to the aim of this panel discussion. Education is not the panacea against such a global and complex phenomenon which touches all countries, all regions, online and offline, and requires commitments from diverse actors, from governments to civil society, to the private sector, of course. But education can nonetheless help address the root causes of hate and promote and uphold non-discrimination, inclusion, and respect for diversity. It is the basis for critical thinking and for greater openness to the others and to the world. These are essential tools for navigating the ocean of information and other content available online. And this is an essential tool to learn how to engage against hateful narratives. This commitment is at the heart of UNESCO's mandate through the promotion of education for global citizenship, the fight against racism, anti-Semitism, and all other forms of intolerance and discrimination, through media and information literacy, and through the defense of freedom of opinion and expression, of course. As part of the United Nations Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech, we at UNESCO have been drawing focus to the importance, when combating hate speech, of promoting, protecting, and upholding international human rights norms and standards, including the equal right of everyone to freedom of opinion and expression, and of utilizing education, and in particular, human rights education and global citizenship education, to enable positive change to help young people engage in public debate responsibly and to reject all forms of hatred. An important point to recognize is that hate speech manifests itself differently depending on the context. And we are fortunate to be joined by experts working in different spaces today. So this session will be a conversation about what educators can do to foster socially responsible citizens for the future, and for us to be able to determine what works best for our educational context to work towards creating a more just and peaceful society. So let us now give the floor to the experts. I've been too long already. Experts who are conducting work in digital citizenship education, in the prevention of violent extremism, digital literacy, and digital rights advocacy. And as a first speaker, I would like to give the floor to Laura Engel, who is an associate professor at the George Washington University and co-chair of the UNESCO Chair in International Education for Development, who will discuss the opportunities and challenges of using digital tools for global citizenship education. Laura, the floor is yours. You have about 5 minutes to present the subject. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karel, very much. And good morning to everyone from the Washington, D.C. area in the United States. Thank you to colleagues at UNESCO and the UNESCO chair for this wonderful invitation. It's great to join this esteemed panel on such a significant and timely topic. I want to start with a story in a context not too far from where I'm located this morning. Earlier this year, in May 2022, in a grocery store in upstate New York, Ruth Whitfield, age 86, and Pearlie Young, age 77, along with 8 others, were murdered in a hate-filled racist attack. Along with body armor and a semi-automatic weapon, the gunman brought a portable camera with him so he could stream the violence live on the internet. He believed in an idea that white people were being replaced, and he hoped that by digitally sharing the violence he inflicted, that he would inspire other similar racist attacks. The video was viewed by millions around the world, just as similar acts of violence worldwide have been watched and rapidly circulated. I start with this story to highlight that hate-filled violence does not happen in isolation. It's not solely bound to one place, one person, one country, one context, as Karel noted in the introduction. Is it about guns? I argue yes, but it's also about the ideas that drive individuals to such violence. These ideas take root far earlier, watered and fertilized in digital spaces, spreading intolerance, anti-Semitism, racial hatred, white supremacy. We know that hate and hate speech aren't new. And in the global digital age we live in, our increased global interconnectedness does not eliminate them. In The Fear of Small Numbers, an essay published in 2006, Arjuna Padarai paints the picture instead of the darker sides of globalization that have allowed for an increase in racially and ethnically motivated violence. Indeed, the speed, the spread, the availability of hate speech, particularly to influential, targeted populations, is one of our greatest challenges in protecting democratic principles and ensuring social cohesion, peace, and respect for humanity. The challenges come in stark contrast to the promises of the global digital age. For example, the promise that free, equal, and equitable access to information enables democratic principles and actions. It promised greater connectivity, a cornerstone of international and domestic understanding, cooperation, and peace. And in many cases, we do have evidence that digital tools can advance the competencies aligned with democratic and global forms of citizenship. For example, with the use of digital tools, we can engage creatively in telling and sharing stories. We can connect our students, our educators, our systems in ways that prior was not even a possibility. We can spur, we can contribute to different social movements aimed at building a better, healthier, and more equitable world. So I think one of the core questions that we have here is, how do we continue to foster these opportunities made possible in our global digital era while addressing the varied challenges, including the circulation of hate speech? First, I want to make 3 points. First, we have to go further than AI tools, as helpful as they may be, to locate hate speech and develop the critical skills in students and educators to decode hate speech, to provide the ethical foundations to help not to share it with others or to create it themselves, and the opportunities to engage in what Davies described as interruptive democracy. And I think Vivek and others could speak to this in issues of dissent, which I'm looking forward to discussing further. Second, approaches to global citizenship education offer notable ways forward. They promote critical and analytic thinking skills, scientific inquiry, and values of peace and common humanity. But the next iteration of thinking about global citizenship has to include digital competencies, including reflective dialogic approaches to understand societal divisions and, again, dissent. And third and finally, beyond guidelines and frameworks related to global citizenship education, from a policy perspective, we need concerted attention on the fractures present in our public education systems, which are leading institutions in the defense of the civic good. The fractures are immense and growing, from teacher shortages, narrowed focus on achievement measures and individual competitiveness, to restrictive policies limiting teachers' freedoms to have conversations about any topic deemed divisive. But as I say these points, I also recognize that we are behind, and we need proactive solutions in a very reactive time. There's a great urgency in addressing these systemic issues, these fractures, as I mentioned, and a great urgency in cultivating the contemporary approaches to learning that emphasize the public good and a common global humanity. I very much look forward to the continued discussion with all of you on these important topics. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Laura. I will immediately pass on the floor to Vivek Venkatesh, who is a UNESCO co-chair in prevention of radicalization and violent extremism, and who is professor at Concordia University in Canada. And he will now discuss addressing hate speech through education. Vivek, you have about 5 minutes to give us a little introduction, and then we'll have an exchange. Thank you, Vivek.
Thank you, Karel. As my students know, if you give me the floor, I can tend to go on and on without stopping. So thank you for the 5-minute warning. I really appreciate it. My name is Vivek. I am a school teacher by training, and I now teach in the Department of Art Education at Concordia University, where I also hold the UNESCO chair in prevention of radicalization and violent extremism. And I'd just like to pick up the baton from where my colleague Laura left it. In terms of addressing hate speech in education, I think one of the policy pieces that I'd like to bring forward has been represented through a large-scale study that my team and I conducted in 2020, 2021, under the aegis of UNESCO. We were looking specifically at how hate speech was addressed or is being addressed in member states' ministries of education. And it shouldn't surprise anyone in this room that hate speech is particularly difficult to define. And therefore, these ministries of education and representatives from these ministries are finding it hard to, in fact, prevent something that they're not able to come to a sizable definition of. This is something that we need to address. While in Canada, for example, hate crimes has been very clearly defined and is, in fact, codified in criminal law, you can be prosecuted for perpetrating, for inciting a hate crime under a very, very specific definition. It's much more difficult to think about what constitutes xenophobia. Where, in fact, are you crossing the line from freedom of speech, from something that is justified as an emotional reaction to an event that you're experiencing versus something that perpetrates or incites violence, whether it's physical or verbal, towards a specific group. So one of the things that we exhort member nations to take care of is think carefully about how you want to adopt clear, precise, and at the risk of repeating ourselves, delimited definitions for hate speech and any such related phenomenon. So think through what it means to be xenophobic, think through what it means to be discriminatory, prejudicial, misogynistic. These are really, really important aspects for us to discuss as we move forward. The other piece that's really important, which Laura alluded to, is how can we ensure that schools remain safe and pluralistic learning spaces. And this is something that my team as well is looking at quite carefully. So while we help develop policies, we're also looking carefully at what it means to be teaching in both safe and unsafe spaces in classrooms. And this particular connotation comes from a very, very important philosopher, Eamon Callan, who teaches out of Stanford University in California. And one of the things we're trying to look at here is how can we build spaces for pluralism? And by pluralism, what we're addressing is, in fact, one of the things that Laura brought up. How do we create spaces for dissension? I think one of the easiest things that we do, and I believe that we're doing this even within this symposium, is we tend to crowd around and gather around people with whom we agree. Very easy for us to get a pat on the back when we're told, wow, I agree with you. It's completely wrong what's happening. Let's get together and, share a coffee, share a beverage over it, and tell ourselves how wonderful it is that both of us agree on an issue. What we're not doing is creating spaces for dissension. How is it that we can listen to the other side, to another perspective, without necessarily vilifying or dehumanizing the person who is bringing that perspective forward. It's very easy for us to laugh off or to decry or to feel repulsed and horrified by someone who is necessarily taking a point of view that is different from ours, that has a very different humanistic, different philosophical, different even epistemological approach than us. So how do we create these spaces for dissension? And that's something perhaps that that we can discuss a little bit today, but something that I urge you to think about more carefully is how do you occupy a space with someone with whom you're not necessarily in agreement? And this is really a principle of agonism that's been brought forward by great political theorists like Chantal Mouffe, Ernesto Laclau, and we can learn a lot in the field of education, especially as we try and move towards more agonistic versus antagonistic spaces. I'll stop there, Karel, and thank you again for this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to discussing and listening to everybody else who is on this panel.
Thank you so much, Vivek, for this great introduction. I'm going now to give the floor to Janice. Let me just find my notes, just one tiny second. Janice Richardson, who's an advisor on digital citizenship, children's right, and digital literacy program. And Janice will now provide us with some insight into teacher guidance and pedagogies to address hate speech in school, but also the problem of bullying. And that would be good, Janice, maybe if you can give us a little idea of how you distinguish these two different phenomena, bullying and hate speech. Thank you very much. Janice, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karel, and good afternoon, everyone. I should begin by saying that I was a teacher for many years in Australia and in Europe, and so I am drawing on practical experience. To address hate speech and bullying, pedagogical approaches need to be evidence-based, and I was very happy to hear what Vivek just said about this. Teachers need to understand the challenges that the digital transformations brought. On average, around 1 in 3 students are bullied across the world. I work a lot in North Africa, Morocco, and Tunisia, and there the figure is almost 1 in 2, and very often bullying turns into physical violence. But about 50% of bullying incidents are linked in some way to online communications. As Vivek said, also, it's far more difficult to find reliable information on hate speech, which is an ever-increasing plague fanned by social media, and we know that that's where most young people spend a lot of time. A study from Pew, but mainly in the United States, and it's one of the few studies I could find on this, says that 1 in 3 people believe that they should have the right to make statements publicly that are offensive to minority groups, which is quite surprising to hear. And of course, digital technology is a rapid means of disseminating such statements. I sit on the advisory board of many social media companies, and Twitter did a study over a period of 7 months of the hateful statements and tweets that were made. But it shows that 60% of these hateful statements were targeting women, 10% LGBT, and a little over 6% Muslims, Jews, and disabled persons. And I think that this sort of information is really important for teachers to understand before they start tackling the issue. These findings underlined how important it is that children of all ages learn about their rights and their responsibilities, both online and offline. If they don't learn it at school, where are they going to learn it? Non-discrimination is a fundamental right, and it's counterbalanced by the responsibility to respect diversity. Teachers have to adopt a multifaceted, cross-curricular approach that valorizes and celebrates diversity and inclusion. And they need to build media and information literacy and digital citizen strategies into their programs. Another fundamental right is privacy. Students need to be taught how and why they need to protect their data, limit out and empty out their cookies, and why they should be using an incognito browser whenever possible. Because data collection facilitates profiling, and data is a valuable commodity for industry. They use it to create algorithms, to engage users through a flow of media and information, to polarize interests. And this is the very antithesis to diversity and plurality, which are the core elements of responsibility. Just take a look at the reels that social media presents to users, or look at the autoplay function on YouTube, where if you look for one video and play the video, you'll get a whole string of related videos. This is even more concerning when, according to several studies taken when schools were closed during the COVID pandemic, internet was the top place that young people went for their resources for school, internet and YouTube. Media and information literacy is therefore a priority if we're going to counter misleading information and representations. Students need support and they need the learning space so that they can really develop their analytical and critical thinking skills, but also self-esteem, because that's one element that's very important that helps all of us not to believe or to question what we see and hear online. These are essential tools to counter the misrepresentations that we see so frequently online. Internet offers a huge range of opportunities for learners to experience many different sorts of multicultural experiences, and they can find a number of perspectives on almost any topic. UNESCO's upcoming teacher guidelines on global citizenship education proposes learning modules that can guide teachers to such resources and provide ideas on their use in class. Students can only learn to act responsibly online if digital technology is integrated as a learning tool right across every subject area in authentic, student-centered learning contexts that foster collaboration and communication with peers, but also with the community and with the global world. Education can't focus on knowledge alone. Now more than ever before, it must be built on 4 pillars: values, attitudes, skills, and knowledge. The Council of Europe's developed an interesting model of 20 essential competences learners need to become responsible digital citizens. In my opinion, and without going into any further detail, these 3 approaches are fundamental. Teach students about rights and responsibilities, including privacy. Make 21st century literacy the golden thread that's woven right across the curriculum, and adopt a holistic, user-centric, project-based approach that encourages students to take responsibility for their own learning. I look forward to hearing what others have to say about this topic, which is, yes, a huge concern for us all.
Thank you so much, Janice, also for the very concrete recommendations, I should say already, which is something we definitely wanted to come up with. So thanks for this. I just want to say for the audience that indeed the panel is extremely focused on the issue of education, and we've spoken mostly about formal education so far, which is really the core subject of the discussion. But of course, this cannot be sufficient, and our approach must be broader. And I think already our 3 speakers have touched upon that particular issue. And that's why I'm particularly pleased to introduce to you Nelson Kwadje, who is calling, I think, from South Sudan. Nelson is the co-founder of Impact Capital Initiative, and he's the chair of an organization that is called at Defy Hate Now in South Sudan. And what's interesting here is that Nelson will speak about the role of youth in engaging with and fighting hate speech online. Nelson, the floor is yours, please.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity. Can you hear me well?
Very well. Go ahead.
Thanks. As Karel stated, my name is Nelson Kwaje. I work for an initiative called Defy Hate Now, based in South Sudan, primarily working on mitigating hate speech, misinformation, and incitement to violence. Been doing this work for the past 5 years in South Sudan, but in other countries like Cameroon, Ethiopia, and Kenya. Probably what a lot of the speakers have already touched on majority of the issues that are facing educators and learners in the 21st century. I want to speak and underscore the challenges that are facing both educators and parents in terms of dealing with a digitally sophisticated world that majority of the children are already in and majority of the teenagers are already in. From my experience, more often than not, we find that a lot of the teenagers and the students are probably savvier and more sophisticated in using technologies than the teachers and the parents. So this puts us in a very difficult scenario where we have people who are supposed to teach the youth. They have all the methodology and the knowledge to pass, but also the tools that are being used are kind of in a mismatch with what the students, the learners are experiencing. So how do we deal with this? And I call it, in terms of what I'm discussing this in another conference, we have what we call now is the attention economy. When we started fast computers, what computers did is basically automated process. After that, computers moved into optimizing process. Now from there on, computers moved into analytics and giving decisions support. But now we reach into the age where computers are into the business of attention. And primarily in the age of social media, you find that all these apps are fighting for the attention of our kids and the attention of our youth. I mean, we have seen the examples of what has been happening in terms of misinformation. We have seen the reports that came from the whistleblowers about Meta and the use and how Instagram influences impact body image positivity among teenagers. We have seen the challenges with TikTok, and many regulators around the world are now considering the options, the wild suggestions of banning it completely. We have seen issues to do with miseducation. You can imagine what if one of your child is asked to do an assignment on the Holocaust, and they bump into an anti-Semitic or a Holocaust denial website, and they base their whole assignment based on that. This is one example, but also we have a lot of examples now and a lot of disputed facts, and we have an environment of information that is rife with misinformation, propaganda, and a lot of other vices that are now kind of occupying the space for information online. So the learners and the students of this age have to encounter all these challenges that probably people my age or your age didn't have to battle with. And one of the challenges, and I stated this in several forums, previously, when a parent wanted to keep their child from engaging in anything that they don't like, what do? They lock the child in. They keep their children within the vicinity. They keep them within eyesight. But now this is not enough. Your child could be inside your bedroom or inside the sitting room, but still get radicalized and probably get ideas that are beyond the control of what you have thought. So what are the challenges here? We have issues of, as I said, we have issues of misinformation. We have issues of a lot of ideas. We have issues of attention span, and we also have issues of influences and issues to do with body positivity, issues to do with ideas and well-being of children.
I think we've lost Nelson, unfortunately. Let's wait a few more seconds.
Resources that are needed.
We lost you, Nelson. We lost you about 30 seconds.
Hello?
Can you
Yes,
hear me?
okay.
Yeah, we lost you a little bit.
Yes, I can
a
hear
few
you.
seconds.
Am I back now?
Yeah, you are back. Thank you. If you can
Yes.
go back to
Okay,
what
good.
you were saying a tiny bit. Thanks.
Yeah, so I said, like, in the context of what we're seeing, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of the schools are under-resourced, both in terms of the knowledge and also in terms of the digital environment that is needed for the 21st century. So this presents a very huge challenge. Education, like doing basic education. So we've seen a lot of initiatives in terms of the 1 giga schools with the UN trying to connect a lot of the schools, bring them back online. But also we have seen other initiatives in terms of changing perspectives, like how do you teach kids empathy? How do you teach kids some of the values that Janice has been talking about? How do you inculcate that into an educational system so that the kids are not only taught what is in the curriculum, but also they are taught like the values and also like how to appreciate others and stuff like that. It is not all hopeless. We have seen also with the internet, also there are like so many issues that are now coming in a positive light. Like we have seen in terms of climate activism, like activism for environmental causes. A young lady from Uganda has championed her causes, and she's now leading campaigning for environmental protection across the world. And we have seen this in so many places where like younger people are now creating affinity and creating linkages that transcend borders and transcend a lot of the existing boundaries that we already have in our places. We have seen people showing solidarity in terms of the environmental causes. We have seen also in East Africa and other places, communities like the LGBTQI, they're extremely oppressed, but then the people are able to build virtual communities and able to find solidarity in these places. So as much as there is a lot of misinformation, there are a lot of vices that are encountered, but there are also a lot of positive notes. What are some of the solutions that I am proposing? I think we need to have parents be knowledgeable and educated in terms of managing technology. Something as simple as controlling the Wi-Fi in your home, or as simple as having like control on the apps that your children download, or having also screen time control for your kids. This is a very simple thing, but a lot of parents ignore. And also like having discussions with your children. Janice was talking about privacy, data privacy. Whom do you talk to online? How do you engage with strangers online? What are some of the issues even that are now being shared online before your children go and learn about it online, before they go and learn about anti-Semitism or stuff like that? These are discussions that can be had in the home. The second point is also on educators. And I'm speaking from really African perspective. We have like educators need to be resourced also. We need to resource educators in the classroom, and they ask you a question and the teacher doesn't have any reference to whatever is happening on TikTok or whatever is happening on Facebook or on Twitter, or the teacher even doesn't know what is a hashtag. So there is a bit of a catch up that education and educators that need to do so that they're able to counter these issues. And the third and the most important thing is a question on policy. And I'm delighted that we have a lot of people here who are working on policy on a global level. We need to spend a lot of time in policy. And in the context of this policy board include kind of formulating policies that are progressive and are able to play in catch up with everything that is happening. And then secondly, providing the resources needed for the implementation of this policy. And then the third thing is the political will. If we don't have this tripod of approach to policy implementation, it fails. Like here, like in times in South Sudan, we have very excellent policies, but then the political will and the resource is not there. So a lot of the time, this just remain conference talk and does not kind of trickle down. So provided these are harmonized, we still have a lot to, we are still able to counter these issues and also ensure that our children have a better future and also are able to live in a better world. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Nelson, for this fascinating presentation. And we move on directly to questions. And actually, if I may start, I have a question for you, Nelson. You mentioned the question, I mean, as a solution, the need for parents to be educated, the need to provide educators with more resources, but you mentioned also the lack of political will and political resources. But there are organizations such as yours that exist in civil society sector, and that can also do part of the work. And without them, I mean, there would certainly not be much going on. So my question is, in addition to what you just said, can you give us a little bit more concrete examples of what your organization, Defy Hate Now, is doing, notably when it comes to community-based peace campaigns to combat hate speech and this sort of thing, so we can really see more concretely how this kind of work manifests itself in the regions in the region in which you work?
Okay, thank you. So in terms of our organizations, we kind of look at two things. First of all, we looked at countering. So that means we want to counter all the biases. We want to counter misinformation, hate speech, and incitement to violence. And we also want to create alternative reality, and that is counter messaging. So we're asking, like, if in the absence of hate speech, what other worlds can we create? What activities can we create that youth can engage on? In South Sudan right now, we run the only publicly available cyber safety hotline. So we have a program called SafetyCom. If you check it online, SafetyCom South Sudan. So it's like a safety communication. So that hotline, whenever you have issues, so we handle all kinds of issues. It's starting from hacked accounts, and that is publicly available. So someone pick their phone, say like, my account got hacked, I got compromised, and we handle more sensitive issues: exposure to indecent content, revenge porn, cyberbullying, all these kind of complaints. We get them, and we literally have a call center where people tackle these issues and provide responses, at times even late in the night. And the second platform that we offer is Check, which is a fact-checking platform. In it, we want publicly available information on COVID-19 vaccination, issues to do with the conflict, issues to do with all kinds of scientifically inaccurate information that might lead to harmful results, issues to do with incitement. So we counter and we fact check this in real time and provide information to the public. We run this currently in South Sudan, but we also do it in Cameroon, which is also a conflict affected area. And the third program, which we run, is called Act for Peace. And it's a fellowship for students in local areas. So we say, like, you're in your locality, we're saying do one action for peace. So this could be mobilizing a group of women to have a discussion on, like, gender-based violence, or at times in some schools, talking with different types of tackling different types of bullying in schools. In Cameroon, we have over 70 fellows that spread across the country, and they organize local activities in their areas, and they try to kind of combine their efforts together to kind of have a snowballing effect in impacting the global, the landscape within their country and also in the region. Understandably, solutions to these issues really have to have a local approach to it. We can't have a blanket approach that can apply in Brussels as well as in Geneva and also in Cameroon and in South Africa. A lot of these issues need context-based initiatives that are led from the grassroots and also that have a very target-specific goal. And with this, we have seen more results.
Thank you. It's very, very clear, and it's extremely interesting. Now I'd like to go back. You mentioned, different skills that you think young people should have to actually be able to counter hate speech. You mentioned empathy. You mentioned other social, emotional skills, and I'd like to go back to what Laura was saying earlier and ask you, Laura, in your view, what are the key competences that are needed for individuals, learners, but also educators, to be able to maybe recognize hate speech when it manifests itself, but also possibly to engage against it online and be responsible and reactive to it. So if you can give more details, because you mentioned it in your presentation, but but now you have space to go more into details.
Yeah, that's great, Karel, and that's a very, very important topic. Janice mentioned the forthcoming UNESCO teacher guidelines, which I think will be a very important resource for educators. And I must say, you know, I'm deeply concerned always about being in spaces where we talk about what educators need to do. Even if we are not doing this intentionally, that we're sort of saying, here are the problems, educators need to take this up. We can't simply saddle teachers with all of these issues, especially, as I mentioned, in an increasingly fragile public education system. And certainly I'm in a context here in the US where we even have policies limiting what teachers can discuss in the classroom and limiting anything deemed divisive, where certain words, including globalization, race, critical race theory, even climate change, are not possible topics. So I want to acknowledge that as I start to think about what are these skills and competencies that we need to have in our systems. And I think what we'll see in these forthcoming teacher guidelines is a really important focus on critical analysis and deeper understanding of the intersections between local context and global issues, including in-person and virtual spaces, that will highlight topics of social responsibility, of creative thinking and reflection. And that's something I'd want to emphasize here, the importance of reflexivity in educators. We can't engage on these topics without having a culture and a set even of competencies around reflexivity, the importance of reflecting on our own uses of digital tools and their impacts in our everyday lives. And I think lastly, when we talk about skills and competencies, and perhaps this goes beyond students and educators, but community school partnerships. I think there's something really essential here that picks up nicely from Nelson. The idea is that we need to engage schools within their local communities to help foster these kinds of skills and dispositions. And I imagine Vivek and Janice have, you know, in their work, more to say on these kinds of specific skills and dispositions.
Thank you, Laura. I'm going to turn directly to Janice precisely to respond the same question. And maybe Janice, and I really appreciated in your presentation the fact that you gave concrete examples. Can you dive a little bit deeper in this and give us some examples of activities that teachers, educators can develop precisely to enhance and promote these skills that Laura has just talked about?
Yes, certainly. And I have been having an interesting conversation with Andrea Gambino during this, who's picked up and asked me pretty much the same question. So first of all, yes, teachers are trained, teachers have a lot to do, but teachers are searching for models. And this is what I really like about the Council of Europe, competences for democratic culture. It gives you 20 competences that you can sort of almost use as a tick box in the classroom. I think teachers need this sort of thing, and we have done this in the teacher guidelines on global citizenship. We actually give at the end of each of the learning modules the suggestions for assessment, formative assessment, I would say, on the cognitive skills, the social emotional skills, and the behavioral skills that we are hoping that they will be practicing in and out of the classroom with their students. But I also think to tackle difficult issues, well, to tackle anything, students can learn mathematics by looking at quality education across the world. They can do language studies by looking at climate change. So find the topics that are really of interest to them. Let the students lead the learning. Teachers should just be there as a mentor and just making sure that nothing is really missed out. I don't know if that's concrete enough for you, but here I'll give you an example. In the quality education learning module, we asked teachers to get their students, but this can also be done with peer educators to look at which countries quality education seems the most accessible for the whole population. And once they've looked at these countries, mapping them perhaps, so learning geography, mathematics, because they're using graphs, etc., we can also bring them to debate why this is happening. Why is it that girls in Morocco are going to school or spending less time in education than girls in France or another country? It gives an opportunity for, it gives a space for dissension. It allows teachers to pick up ideas, but use them in the same way. But the advice that I always give before embarking on this sort of learning, it is necessary that one, the teacher models the behavior that they expect of the young people, that is showing respect for diversity. And two, we all need a code of ethics when we start debating these things so that we know what respect means, how far we can go, how we get over difficult moments. So I think that's the way, and that's concretely how I would suggest it. But you can pick up any of the SDGs and you can do very similar activities around it.
Thank you, Janice. It's very, very clear. And actually you made the transition to Vivek and to one point that Vivek mentioned when he spoke about spaces for pluralistic dialogue or spaces for dissension. When we talk about hate speech, we talk about hate. We talk about the concept of hate speech, the fact that you can actually express hate, or you can express things that are very unpleasant, but that are not necessarily illegal in regard to international standards of freedom of expression. That's one thing. But you also have to help educators and learners navigate extremely contentious questions. You have to help them navigate, I don't know, conspiratorial thinking. How do you manage this? You have to help them navigate questions where you don't have definite answers to provide. So from an educational perspective, and I would say even from a policy perspective, Vivek, how would you suggest we handle these impossible problems?
So maybe I can preface my response, which I think would be quite practical, with a couple of, I guess, theoretical notions. One is my colleague Brad Nelson, who is a professor of Spanish and also a school teacher by training, like I am. He and I have developed a theory of social pedagogy, which brings to bear, I think, some critical features of how we can promote agonistic forms of pluralism. One of the things that we call for is reflexive forms of education, where people are constantly questioning their own knowledge bases, their epistemologies, and are able to step away, let's say, from the embodiment of a phenomenon which is guarded by, let's say, a human figure, to something that exists outside of the person who is speaking about it. The other piece as well is to take into account, especially in an era of post-web 2.0, this notion of neo-community, because people are capable of expressing themselves through different forms of identity politics. We see this happening. We've seen this happening for a long time, but in the wake of COVID and just in the precursor to COVID, identity politics themselves have played a huge role in the way people align themselves politically, philosophically, epistemologically as well. So that needs to be taken into account, that neo-community approaches are not the same as how communities and tribes, let's say, have been formed from a theoretical standpoint. And finally, I think we need to take into account that people wish to be excluded from broader hegemonic conversations in order to subscribe to something that's more inclusionary. So how do you create these exclusive spaces? We work a lot with Indigenous communities here in Quebec, but also in Alberta, who have told us quite markedly that, look, we're happy to collaborate, we're happy to conceive and co-conceive and collaborate on projects which magnify our narratives, but you have to give us the space, time, and the finances to do our own reflection about these issues. We don't want an external gaze upon us. The same thing has happened with us working with marginalized Black communities here in Montreal, and in Montreal North especially, where crime rates and socioeconomic status have significantly negatively impacted Black communities. Again, there's a question of them seeking to create a narrative by excluding the hegemonies that surround them. But practically, what does this mean? I would argue that in a scholastic context, for teachers who are promoting some form of critical civic and critical digital literacy, we have to find ways to ensure that the power relationship is maintained in the classroom. And this may seem a little counterintuitive or different from what Janice was proposing in terms of teachers being facilitators, but I firmly believe that the teacher plays a crucial role in terms of hierarchies of knowledge in the classroom. This is based on a series of studies we're conducting in classrooms, but also through a series of life course narratives and interviews that we conducted with former right-wing extremists in Canada. So one of my postdoctoral fellows was able to gain access to 10 former right-wing extremists, eight male and 2 female, who had been in movements from anywhere from 6 months to almost 25 years over the course of the last 30 to 40 years in Canada. And they were talking specifically about what brought them into the movements, what it was like to be in these movements, and what pulled them out. I was specifically focusing for an article that we're publishing on what was the role of the family in education systems. And a lot of these, in fact, to a person, all 10 of them said they would have appreciated being able to make mistakes in a classroom. They would have been appreciated being able to make mistakes in front of their family and being told that, look, you're barking up the wrong tree. You're thinking in a completely illogical way. What is it that is driving you to hate Jews, for example? So with these right-wing extremists, the anti-Semitism was the biggest issue that drove them towards these underground neo-Nazi movements. They felt these right-wing extremists felt that they were not able to turn to people who they felt they could trust if they were making a mistake, and that they would be chided. Now, this is when they were adolescents, not even in teenage years. And I think we forget that developmentally, we should be allowing our students to be making critical errors in logic. We don't want them to do so. We immediately call them out and insult them. We find ways to demean them. And that's where you find that these echo chambers begin to form in these classrooms themselves. So how do we build, I think, in 3 very categorical ways, spaces for pluralism without necessarily finding ways to delimit conversations and push people into certain categories? One thing is, I think, how do you build civility in a classroom? How can you be civil to one another by protecting what Eamon Callan calls their dignity safety? You should be able to have a civil conversation without ruining the dignity of another person. You need to teach them how to do this, and this comes through trial and error. How do you also teach people to be frank about their opinions? Candor, right? If you can build candor in conversations and allow for the fact that you are going to be offended. You are going to be offended by somebody else's words if they clash with your own ways of thinking and knowing. Then there's, I think, a way forward to building what Eamon Callan calls interpretive charity. And interpretive charity is so important, both from a classroom, but also a public standpoint. How can you assume the best possible outcome of an interaction with someone, especially if that person is in disagreement with you? If you give yourself and the other person a chance to explain how they've arrived at a piece of logic, then you should be able to say at the end of a conversation, look, I really find that you're approaching this from a bigoted standpoint, xenophobic standpoint. You can decide then to not pursue the conversation, but don't immediately find a way to other the person because you think differently from them. So this is, I think, something practical that teachers need to take into account, but ceding some of this control back to the teachers, I think, is really, really important. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Vivek. We're reaching the end of our discussion. Unfortunately, it's been too short, only 1 hour. I want to thank the 4 speakers, also for their contribution to UNESCO's work. I think it's important to acknowledge here that you are working with us. You have mentioned some of the materials that will come out. One is a guide for teachers on digital citizenship, and another one is a policy guide on addressing hate speech through education. Just want to mention here, Vivek knows that by heart already because he was one of the key person behind this endeavor. UNESCO organized last year a global meeting, a global conference of ministers of education with our Director General and the Secretary General of the United Nations that sort of came out with a few recommendations that to serve as a basis for future policy in the field of addressing hate speech. Just want to mention them here and then ask you a last question. So and I will send in the chat some more details about that conference. You have already the website of UNESCO that we have created on hate speech that covers all the areas of UNESCO's work in the field, and that provides you already with a lot of documentation when it comes to education and hate speech. Now, back to the conference, the conclusions were the following. First, member states must engage in specific educational interventions aimed at explicitly addressing hate speech at all levels of education with a lifelong learning perspective. I'm making it short, but that's something important because Vivek proposed a study to prepare the conference with his university, where he found actually hate speech is not really addressed as such in the policies of member states, that they use usually a larger framework of human rights or peace education. And that most often it was not necessarily addressed in education at all. Second, the development of digital citizenship skills with proper attention to social and emotional learning. This is something that we have mentioned many times here in this discussion, with special emphasis to media and information literacy must be considered a priority. Okay. Third, teachers and school leaders at all levels of education must be provided with adequate professional development through an approach that combats discrimination in all its forms and acknowledge and addresses biases. We've said that too. Fourth, hate speech must be addressed through cross-curricular interventions and active pedagogies. And thanks, Janice and Lara, for mentioning this too, in such ways that the root causes of intolerance and discrimination are tackled and that all forms of discriminatory biases are removed from all educational media. This is, of course, an important work at UNESCO. And fifth, and this is, I think, more for Nelson in that respect, and that reflects what he said, we must engage in multi-sectoral cooperation by building partnerships with all relevant stakeholders through a whole of society approach. Sorry for the jargon, but I assume that most people listening to this are in the field of education. This includes first and foremost groups targeted by hate speech, what you just said, Vivek, but also all relevant public authorities, the civil society, as well as the private sector, most notably new and traditional media and internet companies. These are the 5 major, very broad recommendations that came out of this global ministerial meeting. Now, my question for you, considering that we have in the audience a number of policymakers, what would be your one takeaway for them at the end of this conversation? I give you 20 seconds to think about it. Vivek, do you want to start? Your one takeaway after this conversation.
I think my one takeaway after this conversation would be in terms of how we can support policymakers. A lot of what I'm seeing on the ground doesn't necessarily transfer in any meaningful way from a knowledge exchange, from a knowledge mobilization standpoint, to policymakers who can actually make a difference to a larger swath of classrooms. So maybe I'm too positivist in my orientation, but I would like to see some sort of generalizability for some of the evidence, as Janice pointed out, that we're seeing that takes place in ecologically valid frames within classrooms. So what can we do to organize and influence policymakers? I think UNESCO does a really wonderful job. I think you have a lot of responsibility on your shoulders to influence policymakers, but with the with the ways in which you are able to bring together academics, researchers, practitioners, and of course, policymakers. I think that's where the biggest challenge lies, because without an investment, a serious financial investment in teacher training programs that are pluralistic in orientation, I think that we are going to be as lost next year, in the next 5 years, and in the next 10 years as we are right now. And I adopt a pessimistic framework for all of this, but that's what drives most of my work. So I'm still hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you for your insights. And Laura, one recommendation, one takeaway.
Actually, it's going to build from Vivek. I think my takeaway is the need for a whole society approach, a multi-sectoral approach that enables and assists policymakers in managing to promote professional development of educators, to promote the kinds of skills that we're talking about and the specific educational interventions. So I think it has a policy or overall reform focus to it. It's a whole society approach, Karel.
Thank you so much, Laura. Janice.
Well, I'm afraid that I'm going to continue building on that, because for me, the multi-sectorial approach, the plurality is so important. We seem to forget that we don't educate children in schools. Today, they're spending more time online. So when we're bringing the parties together, I think we mustn't forget the internet industry, social media, because they're the ones who are influencing our children. They're shaping the way they're thinking. So bring everyone together and make sure also that we are a model of the behavior that we are trying to promote. And this doesn't always happen with policymakers and with others. And I loved something that Vivek said earlier. Allow people to make their mistakes. We learn more from our mistakes than from our successes. So let's all think about that one.
Thank you very much, Janice. Nelson, do you want to add a word? A key takeaway, a recommendation you'd like people to go away with?
I think one thing, probably as much as we're doing multi-stakeholder, I think holding social media companies and bringing them to be part of the discussion, both in terms of investment and design of their platforms, so that it doesn't have adverse effect on people globally. I mean, I'm stating this on the day that on a few days after Elon Musk bought Twitter already. So I think there is a huge kind of a risk that we're facing in terms of that people who are not elected and who cannot be held accountable manage the bigger part of public discourse globally. So there is need for us to find ways of bringing that into the discussion.
Thank you very much, Nelson, and thanks so much to our speakers for their insights, for being so precise, so clear, and for the outstanding work that they are doing. So we are thankful at UNESCO for the work that we're doing, and we thank also the organizers of this really wonderful conference. Thank you all. Goodbye.